So they were gonna. Credit funds.
Oh, yeah.
So they'll have audience. Maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Nice, already.
They're always, we always have to start
I
there.
have a quick intro.
It is good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going good.
And then eventually.
And now I'm planning on getting a lot of it knocked out this weekend. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's finished. You're leading the flock. Yeah, that's what.
Oh, it's just, yeah, so it was a virtual.
Oh, very good.
You going off a break?
No, I gotta stay good.
Not for work, it's off.
I'll be a little bit of a drive. Yeah,
The
but.
doors is open, I saw students in there, I was very.
Yeah, we got it. Yeah, it's going good though. I have like 20, but we have like today where. No, sorry, I think it's.
We finished it.
Six.
Okay,
Oh,
yeah.
It's literally in the same strip mall, so I told Jalen I would pick it up. But I'm like, that's something that I will probably,
No, that's definitely,
Yeah,
that's true.
actually, you know what I'll do? I'll send them.
Okay, and this is, it ends at 12:30, right?
26, 2 weeks.
Okay. Sure.
But yeah, actually.
Yeah, I don't tell you about them.
It was 10 butterflies within 30 straight.
I think it is, yeah. We have some butterflies you have to do. But
Which one do you like better? Do you like the butterfly space or straight?
we haven't done butterfly.
Oh, okay. I like the butterfly.
They have like ponds.
Yeah. I didn't think the butterfly thing, you don't have the next year when they're.
Yeah, it just like it's.
I was. You know, like that.
Yeah, it's like even then.
Right. On the table.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about like. On the back, in the picture.
Yes.
I'll go with the art.
Yeah, I know. You had to put once even up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The vacuum.
I know.
I know.
I try, yeah.
I'm not happy to come to you, but I'm taking that. So if you're a day that works best for you.
And then. 3 dogs. Yeah.
What about you, Sean? You go for operation?
Yeah, I wish that.
Nah, I'm gonna stay here.
Where are you from?
Total.
Casey.
Really?
I know.
Some days are training.
It's like almost an hour drive. Almost.
So that's whatever else. Sound very.
I'm right there.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna go back tomorrow and come back.
Cool parade.
Yeah, man.
It was,
Much farther in. Like from your bonfires in there, because. Like, that's how they have the kind of whatever. Supposed to be.
I'm trying to memorize the. But still, it's.
You remember the order of dogs?
Order of dogs. I used to watch that.
And what's your plan?
Just think about that. I'm using my schedule.
Live blue, study psychic. I agree, well, that's.
Okay, welcome everyone. So nice to see some new faces. My name is Dr. Michael Amlong. I'm one of the faculty members and leadership team members of the Cochran-Logan Center here. And it's great to welcome you to our second of our fall lecture series as part of the Cochran-Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment. Today, we're very fortunate to be hosting Dr. Elizabeth Neilson, who is an assistant professor in the Education, Social Work, and Psychological Sciences Department at University of Missouri, Kansas City. She also directs the Super Lab, which I love, which is the Substance Use, Prevalence, and Experiences in Relationships Laboratory. It's actually really a nice thing for her to be here because she came in the summer to start collaborating with some of our investigators. And we just got IRB approval this week for a study that we're running between our two labs here at KU. So it's a nice partnership between Lawrence and Kansas City two different universities. So I don't know if you're gonna be talking anything about that study today, or if there's not time today, but we have a nice working relationship that we built with Dr. Neilson. She received a master's of social work and a master's of public health from the University of Michigan, and then completed a PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Washington, where she did her predoctoral internship at the VA hospital in Houston. Her research examines the interplay between gender-based violence, substance use, and sexual and reproductive justice. And a primary goal of her work is to understand mechanisms driving substance-involved gender-based violence and to develop interventions to prevent the perpetration of those acts. She's been funded by NIH, NIAAA, Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Assault, and the National Network of Public Health Institutes for this work. Today, she's going to be giving us an overview of her work, which is at the intersection of alcohol use and sexual assault. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Neilson.
Thank you all for such a warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much, Dr. Amlong, and everyone who helped in organizing this. Obviously, from the title, we're going to be talking about sexual assault. This is a really personal topic for a lot of people. It touches on a lot of people's personal experiences, and so I just want to make sure we're all kind of aware and noticing that we can have a lot of reactions to that work. So in preparing for this, I've kind of divided this talk into 3 sections. Just get my timer started. The what is sexual assault? I know we've got folks from a lot of different backgrounds here. This is just to really help us kind of be on the same page. We'll talk a bit about definitions, prevalence, as well as a little bit on outcomes of victimization. And then we'll talk about the now what kind of is the current understanding of what we think may be driving some of the associations between alcohol and sexual assault. And then we will end briefly with a then what, which is what do we think needs to happen next. I'll pause periodically for questions. Oftentimes, especially if people have like burning questions that are going to affect their comprehension going forward, I think that's just helpful for folks to have that. So sexual assault, the what? And so when we think about sexual assault, I think it's often really important to distinguish that when we research sexual assault, we are often not relying on legal definitions of this. Those are vary state by state, they vary country by country. There's some general agreement, but we also know that that's bound by time and culture. When I lecture on this in my Psych of Gender class, I actually do a whole history within the United States of how we've understood sexual assault. It's fascinating. If you would like to come and talk to me about it, I can also recommend a really good paper on it. But it is different than like a legal definition. Some of what we include in research as part of sexual assault, courts may not necessarily say this meets a legal threshold for that. But the WHO has defined it as sexual activity or attempted activity where consent is not freely given or obtained, with consent being defined as an agreement between partners to engage in sexual activity. This definition also comes from the WHO, which is any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances, or acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person, regardless of their relationship to the victim. And so this is a very wordy, very expansive definition that's essentially getting at the idea that it has to do with sexual acts or those that are attempted. Attempted acts can include those that the person who is attempting to do it is not stopping because of themselves. Maybe someone intervened, maybe something happened, but if they could have, they would have continued to go forward, but something stopped them. And that it's against someone's sexuality, and that it doesn't really matter what your relationship is to the victim. I will note that for this talk, I am primarily talking about offenses against adults. I am primarily not a child offender researcher for the most part. We know that these can include both penetrative contact as well as non-penetrative contact. Tactics, you saw that word in the last slide, means how someone goes about doing this. And this can include things like coercion, so verbal or emotional manipulation. That can include talking about how you'd be really angry or really sad if someone didn't, agree to have sex. It can also include just constant efforts to sort of wear somebody down until they acquiesce. Drugs or alcohol, which we'll obviously talk about a lot today, force and threats of force. There's an article out by a researcher named Anna Jaffe at the University of Washington that's looked at assault that occurs without warning, meaning that the individual may not have even been given the sort of chance to say no or to sort of talk about it. And that's newer research that some folks are trying to do. And there is a spectrum of unwanted experiences that can be included within sexual violence. I primarily focus on contact sexual violence, which is what we define sexual assault as, but things like verbal sexual harassment could be and often are conceptualized within a spectrum of sexual violence. Most of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is primarily focusing on sexual assault that's physical in nature in some point. I do have new research if folks want to hear about it, looking at technology facilitated sexual violence that's obviously becoming really more widely known about now. This is also conceptually related to things like reproductive coercion and coercive condom use resistance, which is some of my other work. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but we know that part of why I use the phrase gender-based violence is it's really hard to disentangle all of these things. They're all related to each other, but is conceptually related to that as well. Because I'm going to be talking a bit more about alcohol and drugs, I'm just going to briefly mention that there's been a lot more research, especially in the last 30 years, looking at sexual assault that's involved alcohol or drugs, and this has had different language associated with it. Oftentimes folks talk about alcohol or drug facilitated sexual assault, which means that drugs or alcohol were used in some form of the assault. And so this can encompass a wide range of scenarios. It could mean proactive, so deliberately giving somebody alcohol for the intention of sort of making them incapacitated or wearing them down, giving them a drug that is going to make them unable to consent. It also can include opportunistic scenarios. And so that can just mean you didn't necessarily have the intent to pursue sex with this person, but this person is more out of it, more unable to consent. And so it's a more opportunistic rather than a premeditated act. And that last one is far more common than we see. And certainly is more culturally sanctioned within our current context, that especially within college populations, there's a sort of expectation of having alcohol involve sexual contact. And so many people don't necessarily think about this as something that they're doing that could be coercive or aggressive because we have a lot of cultural norms around it, but is something that we've started getting better at measuring. We used to only ask people, have you deliberately given someone something so that later you could pursue sex? And many people will say no, but if you ask, did you ever kind of take advantage of the fact that somebody was too incapacitated or unable to say no? And they'll say yes to that. So now we've kind of more transitioned into language around incapacitated sexual assault. So sexual assault rates have been relatively constant over 4 decades of research. It's like really quite phenomenal if you look at the research coming out of the late 80s, how it's really consistent across time. Some of that might be because we're getting better at measuring it, and even if it's decreasing, we're finding more cases. But some of those first papers by Mary Koss from 1987 are saying the same thing now. So surveillance studies worldwide differ a lot based on methodology, and so you see a lot of different numbers. The WHO, who does a lot of research on this, oftentimes lumps intimate partner violence and sexual assault sort of into one question. They're often assessing a lot of different health behaviors in these surveys. They often don't have a lot of time to get into the nuance. But we know that 1 in 3 women in the world experience intimate partner violence and or sexual violence. And 1 in 9 men in the world experience intimate partner violence, which often includes sexual violence in these measures. We know this number is likely much higher. There's a lot of stigma for men to come forward. We oftentimes also have not been as adept at measuring sexual assault within men. We've only now recently gotten better within the United States about asking items about being forced to penetrate somebody else. We didn't used to include those, and so that those have gotten better at measuring those, but we know this number is likely much higher. Most of my work focuses on the United States. In the United States, 50% of women report at least some form of contact sexual assault since the age of 14, and 1 in 4 experience attempted or completed rape. There's a great paper by KU's Charlie Muehlenhardt about the 1 in 5 statistic among college students that I would recommend. We also know that in the United States, 30% of men report contact sexual assault and 1 in 9 men experience attempted or completed rape. These differences vary greatly by race and ethnicity. We also know most of these statistics are coming from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. We are hoping they continue to do that. It's administered by the CDC. We don't know if they will. There are 2 places that I think it's important when we're talking about this specific topic to point out that the nature of the sampling for the National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Violence Survey does not include people who are currently incarcerated. And we know that among women who are incarcerated, their rates of sexual violence victimization are incredibly high. And their rates of substance use related to their sexual assault victimization are also high. Melissa Zielinski at the University of Arkansas does some amazing trauma-related work, as well as substance use-related work with incarcerated female populations. These numbers also don't include people who are in detention centers. And we know that people in detention centers have about 3.5 times the rates of those in the general population. And that's just the nature of how these data are collected. We also know that rates of sexual assault victimization are at least twice as high for people who are sexual and gender minoritized folks. Bisexual cisgender women have the highest rate of sexual assault among cisgender individuals. Dr. Lindsay Orchowski at Brown has been doing some intervention work with bisexual women around prevention before her funding was cut. And then approximately 50% of trans individuals report penetrative sexual assault victimization in their lifetime as well. And then these rates are higher among Black and Indigenous folks as well. And so we're really seeing a lot of higher rates among those who experience marginalization, both in terms of their victimization, but also in terms of the after effects. They experience very high rates of stigma, a lot of victim blaming, and it's often very hard to access care. There's lots of systems that are set up. And of course, we know that that is likely being exacerbated by funding and accessibility issues, particularly for those who are gender and sexual minoritized folks. I know what room I'm in. I don't have to sell people here on how this is bad for you. We will briefly talk about, sometimes I do, but there are much higher rates of PTSD, major depression, and suicidal behavior. I believe the rate for suicidal behavior is about 13 times more likely for people who experience this. A lot of academic and occupational problems, relationship difficulties, and physical health problems. Most of my research in this area focuses on reproductive health, but there's a lot of research on cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease. It's bad for you. We also know that victims of sexual assault are hugely overrepresented in substance use treatment, which in particular for folks who are gender minoritized individuals and female survivors can be really hard for them when accessing substance use treatment because the population is often overwhelmingly male. And so being in groups with other folks is something we talked a lot about when I was doing work in the VA of how do we kind of create those spaces that are helping folks manage kind of traumatic related responses within those groups while also accessing substance use care. They report more negative consequences of substance use. And we also know that survivors of alcohol and drug facilitated assault are hugely vulnerable to stigma from others. There's a lot more victim blaming that they experience if they were intoxicated at the time of assault. That can occur in both kind of general population. It can also occur in therapeutic contexts as well. They experience a lot of self-blame and a lot of low self-compassion and are often less likely to report it and often less likely to seek treatment related to symptoms. Any questions? Okay. So those are all victimization rates. So I do research on both victimization and perpetration. And what we know about the sexual assault perpetration rates is much less studied. We are getting better at it. One thing that we do know is that people of any gender can perpetrate sexual assault. And we know that it occurs across genders. We do know that the vast majority of survivors report that their perpetrator was a cisgender man. That does seem to be overwhelmingly the case. About only 20 20% of male survivors report their perpetrator was female. We need more research on female perpetration, like that's incredibly important, and we're really missing a lot there. I have some colleagues who are interested in looking at perpetration within gender expansive communities. That is a very delicate issue that obviously has to be and is informed by a lot of systemic factors as well. And so we're really trying to let folks within those communities really take the lead on kind of understanding how we can ask those questions and how we can think about creating community-led interventions in that area. We know that by age 21, about 9% of youth report perpetration, and about 4% report attempted or completed rape. Community samples, it's really variable. It seems to be that upward almost 30%, but it's between 7 to 30% report perpetrating since the age of 14. What does seem to be pretty consistent is the college populations. So it looks like approximately 30% of college men report perpetration at least once since the age of 14. And up to, depending on what other screening criteria you use, it can be as much as 40%. So my research group often recruits people who drink relatively regularly and engage in casual sex, usually some level of risky casual sex, so not using condoms consistently. And it seems that those two things together, you get a higher rate of people who are perpetrated, which may be because of, if you're relatively sexually active, you may have more opportunity to perpetrate. It may be because of other things. We could do an entire talk about why we think those things are associated with each other, but it can be higher essentially based on what you're recruiting for. And as I noted, we need more research on perpetration across identities. So in setting up this talk, I think oftentimes people are ready for me to start talking a lot more about like victimization, since that's what like most people who do this work do. And something that I noticed when I started doing this work, but particularly when I was in clinical contexts, often at the VA, the way they would talk about sexual assault was almost like they were talking about lightning. Like someone's just like walking down the street and you get struck by lightning. And it's just like, this doesn't just happen, you know? One, there's no evidence to suggest, lightning is a natural phenomenon. There's no reason to suggest that sexual assault is a natural phenomenon. I'm unconvinced, the evolutionary psychologists can debate me on that if they want, but I have not been convinced that that's a natural phenomenon. But it removes a lot of agency from the people who are actually engaging in the behavior, namely perpetrators. The other thing that I thought about, which is why I like this lightning kind of metaphor, is you need very specific conditions for lightning to occur. If we walked outside right now, the likelihood that one of us would get struck by lightning is relatively small because the conditions that would create that have not occurred. And if we are going to understand what is actually causing this behavior, we actually need to understand what is going on in the moment, particularly because we know with lightning, where there is one lightning bolt, there is often others, and it is a huge predictor of more. And so for me, the main thing that I have been interested in is understanding what is actually happening in the moment to cause perpetration. Because the goal of this is prevention and intervention. The goal of this is to reduce it and to end it, and intervening with perpetrators is the most logical way to stop sexual assault. This flies in the face of like how we as a world have kind of thought about doing this for a long time, but it really is the most logical. I know a lot of people who do work with preventing victimization and work with a lot of potential kind of risk reduction programs. To their credit, intervening on perpetration is really challenging. It is incredibly hard work to do. Most people who, if you're targeting perpetration, are way less motivated to change their behavior than potential victims. They are less likely to, or even bystanders, they're less likely to see it as a problem. We also know that a lot of our programs that are universal may be iatrogenic to people who are at the highest risk of perpetrating. So I know that like every university right now like has some kind of like sexual assault prevention program that you have to do before you register for classes. And there are concerns from a lot of researchers that if you are somebody who is coming in and may have already perpetrated in the past, or you have a lot of attitudes that support perpetration, you go into those programs, you find them super demeaning and you get really defensive and you actually walk out worse, which is, I think as a psychologist, I am always humble to the fact that you could make someone worse based on what you're doing. I think oftentimes we want things to work in this domain. We want to do that, but that just might not be what the data suggest. And to my credit to my colleagues who do a lot of work with risk reduction, those are the most successful programs. So Dr. Charlene Sen at the University of Windsor has currently the most successful program of reducing sexual assault. It is focused on preventing victimization. It focuses on things around changing your own behavior and engaging bystanders. These do have the most success for actually like lowering it right now. I would argue that part of the reason that we do not currently have a lot of interventions that work with perpetration is we do not have a solid scientific understanding of why perpetration occurs. That if we are going to have research-informed interventions, we need to have more robust research to understand what's going on. I did once have someone say to me, what if we do understand and we just can't change them? And I'm a clinical psychologist, so I believe you can change anyone, but I do think we need more on this. So the now what? So some of the earliest work on this that's continued is we know that in general, those who perpetrate generally report greater alcohol consumption. This is at the global level. If we're looking at purely survey correlational work, there was a really good paper out from someone at K-State about 1.5 years ago that did a big meta-analysis on college level sexual assault and found that alcohol was one of the most robust predictors of it. This is true in terms of how frequently they drink, the quantity with which they drink, and heavy episodic drinking. And so they tend to be folks who drink more. We also know that over half of sexual assaults involve alcohol, but it is not a clear direct effect. And when Dr. Amling and I first started working together, he said the thing that I feel like we always say, which is if it was a clear direct effect, we would know. It would happen all the time and it would just be really clear. It's not. It's often indirect or acts as some kind of moderator or context. The context in which someone is also drinking seems to be really important. Being in what people call sexualized drinking contexts. So those are things like clubs, bars, I'm not trying to like hate on the Greek system, frat parties, like places where there's kind of an expectation of linking up alcohol use do seem to be important contexts. Because I'm very interested in studying what is immediately happening, it means we have to get as close to in the moment of when perpetration happens as possible. That's obviously really hard to do. So I use experimental paradigms to study this, and we do know that experimental paradigms have found that alcohol exerts what we would say a causal effect on perpetration. How do you actually study this in a lab ethically? Because you can't have somebody engage in sexual assault in the lab, both for protection of a victim, but also having people go in and do illegal behavior in a lab is also unethical from a research ethics perspective. So we have over past like 25 years or so developed proxy measures of perpetration in the lab. And there are a variety of ones that you can do if you are interested. There is a great paper by Kelly Davis, I don't know if you can actually see the cursor, that goes through a lot of these. And I will briefly talk about them. The first that some people use are what are called imposition tasks, where you essentially are asking somebody in the lab or seeing if somebody will do something that imposes on another person. People do these all the time with regarding aggression, other kinds of things. The way that most people do this when it comes to sexual behavior is a paradigm that was at Georgia State, kind of started at Georgia State, where you have a research participant and there is a Confederate person, usually a female experimenter, but it could also be whom they think is another female participant. They either are introduced to her or told that she exists. And then she scurries away. She is not involved beyond just like the initial introduction. And then they are told, the participant is told, this person does not like viewing sexual content. You have a choice where you could have her pick a video that she's going to watch, and you could pick a video that is sexually explicit, or you could pick like a cooking video, something that's not. And then they choose which one she watches. So you can kind of see how this sort of plays into the idea of they are told she does not want to watch the sexual content. You can decide if she is going to or not. in case there are any IRB members in the room, she doesn't actually do it. Like, that's not actually what happens. This paradigm has been used across a variety of methods. There's actually some really cool work looking at how bystanders may actually intervene, or how the presence of bystanders may affect whether somebody is willing to do this or not. And Rochelle Leone at Colorado State is actually doing this right now with couples to look at couples related sexual violence, which is super cool. You can also look at what we call behavioral intentions in vignettes. And so this is just giving somebody either a very detailed written scenario or a video that they watch, and then you ask them, if you were in this situation, how likely would you be to do any of these things? We use behaviorally specific measures. We don't say words like sexual assault or rape, because people wouldn't generally put that they would, but we use very behaviorally specific things. I primarily use written vignettes. They are based on qualitative work that we have done with folks that we're recruiting for, and we ask them specific questions about what kinds of things, where do you go to meet people? What kinds of things make you think that someone is interested in these kinds of interactions? And then we make them very eroticized to get as close to realistic sort of situations as possible. Many people use videos. I do not for the most part, because videos introduce a lot of irrelevant stimuli that can actually take somebody out of the vignette. I will also say, in case anyone here has ever tried, acting is like really hard. Like, it's actually I have a lot of respect for people who act now, because watching like really bad videos of like people acting, wow, like really, like good job to the professional actors out there. It's challenging work to do. There's also just other irrelevant stimuli. A researcher at Rutgers, she is doing a lot of really, she has a lot of video work, and one thing that she got a lot of feedback on is a lot of her videos and the parties that we're depicting and the people who were there were really just not relevant to like Black communities. Like, they were like, our parties do not look like this, like what we are doing does not look like this. Nobody in this video looks like people like this. Like, if you're gonna do these videos, you might need to actually tailor these more, which is good feedback for folks to get. There's also audio recordings that you can give people where you actually have them listen to a sexual encounter and essentially say, when you stop it when you think you would stop, like at which point in the kind of, so like it starts with kind of a casual sexual situation. And then as the person in the scenario starts to say, I'm not really interested in going forward, kind of where it stops. It doesn't typically actually depict like an actual sexual assault. Yeah.
So where does like VR fit into this, if you could do it?
Yes, Tony Abbey at Wayne State University has done a VR analog of this work. I've seen it. It's incredibly impressive, especially for a research context. It's not like an Oculus or anything like that. Like, we don't have tech money with this work, but in that she actually does she mostly works with male perpetrators against women. You actually can like pick physical attributes of like your dating partner. The prompt is pick someone that you would like want to go on a date with. And then they're typically, I believe, at a party. There's some folks at University of Nebraska, Lincoln too, who are doing VR work with bystander intervention as well, where you're kind of like walking through a party and you can sort of see a situation unfolding and then can decide to like intervene or not. It's cool. It's really cool stuff. All this, by the way, that I've referenced was all NIH funded work.
Nice subtle dig you got there.
If you paid taxes in the last 30 years, you contributed to this research. All right, so I'm just going to walk you through a common paradigm that I use when looking at this in the moment to sort of understand how we actually can look at this in the lab. So this is a typical protocol for one of my laboratory-based studies. If I'm doing an alcohol, which this is an alcohol administration study, I am predominantly recruiting moderate to heavy drinkers who don't have any problems with alcohol, which sometimes is a tricky needle to thread, but depending on what the alcohol dosage is going to be. Sometimes we will also recruit for some additional factors. I've been a part of projects that have only recruited people who've perpetrated in the past. I've also been a part of projects where we've recruited people who are non-monogamous. We've recruited people who are also engaged in sexual risk-taking behaviors if we're sort of trying to get like a higher likelihood population. It just depends. They do often do a lot of surveys. One of the main things we ask about in our surveys is past sexual aggression. Does anyone want to guess why we would ask about past sexual aggression? Yes, I'm a behaviorist. Best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So we almost always recruit for that. We then do an alcohol administration. We typically randomize by that sexual aggression history just to make sure we can get an equal number in our conditions. Depending on what dosage we're giving them, that's going to depend. I have gone up to 0.10, which is above the legal limit. I've never gone above 0.10. I know some people who go to 0.12, but you get a lot more throwing up with that, and you have to make, and your population just gets smaller because you have to make sure that they've administered that to themselves recently. 0.10 is also more annoying because I often have to give people Everclear at that point. And Everclear mixed with cranberry juice is unpleasant. The study that Dr. Emily and I are doing, we're doing 0.08, and we're going to use vodka. We use a yoked control design, which means that everybody who is in our alcohol group, everyone in our control group gets yoked to someone in our alcohol group. So how quickly people get intoxicated, super variable, incredibly idiographic, absolutely fascinating to me. I almost decided to become a pharmacologist because I was like, how does this happen? Like, why is it that one person, they drink our beverages and then they're immediately where we want them to be, and another person, it took an hour and 15 minutes for them to get all the way up. We administer breathalyzers at a pretty equal rate, and so we have every control person gets the same number of breathalyzers as somebody in our alcohol group to control for time effects and contact with it, so that we're getting rid of that. And then we typically do our behavioral proxy. So once they come, we typically are doing this on the ascending limb, although I think there's a lot more research that we need on the descending limb. They read an eroticized vignette that's written in the second person. The way I typically write my vignettes is they start at a party or a bar, and they meet up with somebody that they have previously had sexual contact with. They go back to one of their apartments, and then there is some consensual initial sexual activity, and then she gradually gives escalating indications that she is not interested in having sex. And we try to make those start pretty subtly. So just moving of hands and things like that to ultimately verbally saying, I'm not interested. And then it ends there. We ask participants, what would you do in that situation? And then people go through detoxification procedures and whatnot. These studies are really safe. Participants indicate absolutely no distress. In one of the studies I did, we measured sexual arousal during the study, both subjectively as well as physiologically through penile plethysmography. And the studies work in terms of seemingly to have sexual stimuli that participants respond to. Participants also generally say these are pretty realistic, which is good since they're based on actual data. All right, so I'm going to talk about digging into what we know. So psychologists love good theory. There's a lot of theories about sexual assault and alcohol. Lots and lots of them. One thing that I will note, and these are all theories that have been developed and applied for sexual assault. These top three are actually the only three that are actually alcohol theories that have been applied to sexual assault. And so if anyone's familiar with alcohol myopia theory, that is a theory that's been developed to explain how alcohol affects behavior. It doesn't have to be sexual assault behavior. It can be anything. Same with alcohol expectancies, and even deviance disavowal theory is developed an alcohol theory to explain deviant behavior, but it doesn't have to be sexual assault. These other ones are models that are for sexual assault or don't have to involve alcohol. And so these are ones that essentially alcohol has been integrated into. Although I will give credit where credit is due, the motivational facilitation model is by a researcher named Michael Cito. And while it was not an alcohol model, he did in his first paper on this say explicitly that alcohol was a very common part of the model. It wasn't an alcohol theory, but he did note that in there. All right, so I'm going to focus on alcohol myopia theory and alcohol expectancy theory and how we have used these to try and understand how alcohol is associated with perpetration. And I'll walk you through a few studies. I'm also not doing great on time, so we're going to do our best. All right, I'm assuming many people here are familiar with alcohol myopia theory. It's the idea that when you are intoxicated, alcohol affects the cognitive processes and information processes. Your kind of ability to do that such that you focus on the cues in your environment that are salient and relevant to you, and then you act on those go cues. And so this is Jin saying, don't worry, they didn't hear you, say it way louder. This is tequila saying, trust me, man, you can dance. And so the idea is that you are focusing on those cues that you think are the most relevant and salient for you and are going to act on those. And I'll explain how this relates to sexual assault in a minute. Cues that facilitate sexual assault perpetration may be present in an environment, and cues that inhibit perpetration may not be present. And so this is often how it has been applied, is that essentially when you're out somewhere, if you're intoxicated, the cues that you perceive are those that are going to be conducive to sexual assault. And I will give you more examples of that in a moment. And then the cues that inhibit are not present. Cues can be external or internal. So cues can be in the context that is around you in the environment. They also can be emotions, attitudes, personality facets, thoughts that you're having. So that's alcohol myopia theory. Alcohol expectancy theory is essentially the idea that individuals consume alcohol in ways that facilitate getting the outcomes they expect. And when intoxicated, people then can act in ways that conform to and confirm their expectations, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What is notable about alcohol expectancies is that they can develop over time, even if you have never consumed alcohol, just by being in the world. You can sort of expect, you can learn how you think alcohol is going to affect you. And that one kind of hypothesis to this is that if you are in the presence of alcohol-related cues, that can activate or prime these kinds of networks. And this has been integrated with alcohol myopia theory, such that essentially if you're drinking or in a context where there's drinking, it sort of activates these beliefs. You then notice through alcohol myopia theory the cues that are associated with these beliefs, and then you act on them, which can then strengthen the expectancies. So we have actual sexual assault alcohol expectancies that Tony Abbey at Wayne State, the same person who developed the VR that she developed back in the late 90s. And early 2000s. And so we actually have alcohol expectancies about sexual assault. The ones that have been the most studied are what we call sexual enhancement or sexual drive alcohol expectancies. So the idea that when you're drunk, you have a higher sex drive. That has been the most studied. And I think in part because it's the one that has shaken out the most in the research. There's also some expectation that alcohol disinhibits women that are linked to perpetration. And then general ideas that you're aggressive when you're drunk seem to be associated with emotions that facilitate behavior. So all of this is leading up to, I think, some of the most common areas where these theories have been leveraged to understand alcohol. And the first is misperception. So sexual misperception is the idea that you misperceive a partner as being interested in sexual activity when they're not. It is without a doubt one of the most commonly studied mechanisms through which folks believe alcohol may influence sexual assault. And so the idea behind this theory and a lot of the research on it is that when you are focused on go cues, you are more likely to inaccurately assess how interested your partner is in sex. This work has been done by Tony Abbey. It's been done by a lot of folks using alcohol and non-alcohol paradigms, but that essentially people tend to misinterpret women's kind of smiling as like overt sexual interest. When they are intoxicated, they are more likely to pursue sexual behavior and say, oh, she seemed like she was really interested in me when they were intoxicated. This can become more acute based on external cues. So partner's dress has been something that's been looked at. So people who are dressed in smaller clothing that I used to call it club clothing, but I don't know if anyone goes to the club anymore. So I don't know if that's a helpful term anymore. Behaviors also. And so there is a study by Teresa Treat that found that even just like touching a participant on the shoulder, if they were intoxicated, they were far more likely to interpret that as an indication of sexual interest. And then a lot of research has looked at attitudes. So sexual drive, alcohol expectancies, rape supported beliefs, sexual stereotypes, peer norms supporting sexual assault, all of these seem to be associated with perpetration when somebody is drunk. When they are not drunk, seems to kind of not have as strong of an association. And so the theory behind this is that perhaps these beliefs are sort of something that somebody is either thinking about or sort of leaning on when they are intoxicated, with the idea that these are being activated when drinking or in drinking context. So using some of my own data, we actually were trying to replicate some of this work. It hadn't been looked at for a little while. And so this is a paper I had come out last year, where essentially we were looking at an alcohol administration study where we assessed sexual drive-related alcohol expectancies. And then we looked at how much they were perceiving sexual interest in the vignette that we gave them. And so at this point in the vignette, the woman in the vignette is pretty clearly saying she's not actually interested in sexual activity. And we asked participants during the story, how sexually aroused do you think she is, and how interested in continuous sex do you think she is? And then we asked, how likely would you be to engage in sexual behaviors? And we controlled for past sexual aggression, because again, it's usually pulling somewhere. And then we looked at differences in these associations by alcohol condition. And indeed, we found that more alcohol expectancies around sexual drive. So again, thinking I expect to be more sexually interested when I'm drunk was associated with more misperception, but only for people in the alcohol condition. And that this was associated with further perpetration. We also find this again kind of across studies. I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, but a researcher at the University of Central Florida, Jackie Warner, and I wrote a paper together. It wasn't an alcohol administration study, it was just a vignette study, but she looked at alcohol expectancies over time across the interaction. So she had multiple stopping points throughout the story and was asking about sexual drive-related alcohol expectancies. She also looked at how much intoxication or how intoxicated the partner was. And it seemed that having an intoxicated partner seemed to boost these sexual drive-related alcohol expectancies, that if they were depicted as having a sexual partner that was intoxicated, they reported more sexual drive-related alcohol expectancies for themselves. She also found that they changed across the sexual situation. And so what she found is that a lot of participants kind of saw this increase in sexual drive-related alcohol expectancies across the situation. But once the partner said no, those expectancies dropped. And that was protective. People who had the expectancies drop ended up generally being less likely to pursue sex after a partner had said no. However, they didn't decrease for everybody, and people who didn't see as sharp of a decline in their alcohol expectancies were more likely to continue pursuing sexual activity. One of the things that I will just highlight about this paper that's super cool is she actually recruited both heterosexual men and sexual minority men, and people could pick the gender of the partner that was in the sexual scenario, and we got the same results across folks. And so that's pretty cool. So this is work that, again, I've done a fair bit in the past looking at sexual misperception. I'm going to talk briefly about what we're doing now. I like sexual misperception. I think it's a crucial mechanism that seems to have a lot of robust data around it. One of my critiques around a lot of the previous work is it's all very cognitive, and it's all about like attitudes and beliefs. And like, to be fair, that makes a lot of sense. You put hegemonic masculinity in a model, it will be associated with sexual assault perpetration. Like, it is a surefire way. However, I was trained in DBT. I really like emotions. I find it really interesting, and there's far less work on emotions. And alcohol has an effect on emotions and seems to influence our emotion regulation abilities. The emotions that have been studied the most are actually sexual arousal, which does seem to facilitate sexual behavior. And similar to what we have found with alcohol expectancies, we see that many people, when a partner says no, their sexual arousal drops, and then they are far less likely to engage in perpetration. But there are some people who it does not. It seems to maintain in the face of refusal. It does not typically go up. There has been a lot of research that's tried to figure out, are there some people who are like kind of sexually aroused by the refusal? And while there may be a very small subset, these are all Canadian researchers who get to do this fun work, they have found generally that has not seemed to have followed through. It seems to be a failure of inhibition of the sexual arousal response rather than a kind of drive towards that refusal. And I can talk through some of what their research has done. The other emotion that has been looked at the most is anger and power. And this is based on theories of rejection and feminist theories around sexual assault with the idea of like sexual violence as an overt attempt to have power over other people. And this has been looked at with regard to rejection and provocation paradigms. So either explicitly having some kind of rejection built into the story, like I'm not interested in having sex with you, or an actual provocation. And I'm going to talk about two studies that get at that. With the idea that while this has been looked at, the tweak that I have done with my research on this is that many people regulate their anger on a daily basis. That's one of the cool things about being a person. And so I'm really interested in looking at how we regulate anger and how that may actually affect things. So this was an alcohol administration study I did where we were looking at state emotion regulation. So how well in the moment when reading the vignette, they felt like they could actually manage their emotional responses. And we looked at how that was associated with intentions, but also how angry they were in response to her saying, I don't want to have sex. They were. And then we looked at whether alcohol would moderate this association. We couldn't do a three-way interaction. We didn't have enough power. Although 100 people for an alcohol admin study is actually like a lot of work. We actually didn't find any alcohol effects with regard to this association, but we did find that there was a significant moderation between emotion regulation and anger, and in a like really good news kind of way, where I'm going to show you a graph on the next slide that shows you this, that visualizes this interaction. And so the blue, purple, and red lines are the levels of anger, and then this is emotion regulation. High emotion regulation means good, means they're doing a great job regulating their emotions. And what you can see is that as emotion, well, there's this association between anger and sexual assault perpetration intentions. As their emotion regulation increases, or for people who have really good emotion regulation, that association between anger and perpetration is going down. And we actually did some analyses around the endpoints that we actually found that for the men that were the angriest in response to her rejection, if they had the highest emotion regulation among our sample, their likelihood of perpetration was indistinguishable from those who weren't angry at all. That they actually like that association like really went away, which for us was really good news. I will say this was a study where they weren't super angry. It's in a lab, there's a lot going on. I won't lie to you, they did an hour and a half of surveys before this, and so some of them were a little annoyed how long they had been there. But this we felt was really exciting and good news, and I am really interested in continuing to do that. I have also been a part of a project that looked at an attempt to integrate the theories around sexual arousal and anger and power. And so Kelly Davis at Arizona State University, she has done some research on what are called sex motives. So like why you have sex, and she developed some items that are having sex to feel in control, having sex to feel powerful, particularly over a partner. And I've done some work on how fears of connecting with other people may actually lead to power and like feelings of power in sexual scenarios. So Kelly and I put together a paper using two data sets. We did study 1, study 2, where we were saying, okay, if somebody has sex because they want to feel powerful, do they actually feel more powerful in a sexual situation? And is that conducive to sexual arousal? So sort of, is there this feedback loop where you want to have sex to feel powerful, you feel more powerful, you feel sexually aroused, and then maybe that facilitates intentions to perpetrate? And we were interested in looking at, well, what does alcohol do in this situation? And we found in the first study that power-related sex motives did in fact lead to more kind of feelings of wanting to be in control, feeling control in the moment. And that did produce sexual arousal, but the sexual arousal itself didn't really produce any sexual assault intentions. It was really all kind of coming from the power. And alcohol didn't really do much except that intoxicated folks who had previously perpetrated were way more likely to perpetrate again. So we kind of looked at this and we were like, okay, something's happening here. What do we think else might be happening? And this is where we had study 2 of that paper, which was her data, which only recruited men who had perpetrated in the past. And what we found, when again, we wanted to look at all of these things, she had also in this study had an emotion regulation intervention. It was very brief, like we're talking like 10 minutes. And there were 2 conditions that you could be in. You could have a cognitive restructuring intervention, so changing your thoughts, or you could have a mindfulness one. How many people here like mindfulness? Anyone? Yeah. Get excited to be disappointed. People who love mindfulness hate the results of the study, and I love mindfulness. So we actually found that in this study, we did find a very lovely little indirect where we had people who got alcohol way more likely, there's a error. Power-related motives were related to power-related emotions, which was related to more sexual arousal, which was related to sexual aggression intentions. The line should be from alcohol to there. We did find that there was a significant interaction between alcohol intoxication and emotion regulation on sexual arousal. And this ended up being an incredibly powerful effect, whereby like pretty much all of our results were coming from this moderated indirect effect. Where for non-intoxicated men, cognitive restructuring buffered the effects of power-related sex motives on sexual arousal, which then was protective against sexual assault perpetration. So essentially, when they were sober, if they could engage in some kind of thought challenging around, and we didn't even tell them what to do it on. We were like, use the skill, like a good therapist. Do the skill, do the thing. And they had less sexual arousal, they were less likely to perpetrate. But for intoxicated men, the mindfulness intervention actually made the sexual arousal worse / higher, and they were more likely to perpetrate. Now, we've spent a lot of time trying to dig into that situation. We think what actually happened there is that it was a very generic mindfulness. It was just like non-judgmental acceptance. Well, probably should be doing that in this situation. Yeah. And so I'm doing a study right now. It's not an alcohol study, looking at a values clarification and whether doing kind of pro-social values clarification ahead of time in concert with mindfulness may actually be helpful. I actually do think this is a really important finding though, because again, we can make people worse. And they were fine at the end. Like we all did all sorts of good stuff there. All right. So where I'm going to end for here is, why do we think that this may happen with emotions? We think that we can apply alcohol myopia theory to this, whereby emotions prompt action, right? That's part of why we have an evolved emotion system, is they prompt behavior. And so we think that they may function as go cues, again, depending on what the emotion is. If it's sexual arousal, if it's anger, it may just really, in the context of alcohol intoxication, prompt behavior. There's also research on motivational myopia, whereby when you're in a heightened emotional state, you are just more likely to, again, focus on cues that continue that emotional state. So, if you're going through a breakup and then you're like listening to sad music, you're like, I'm just going to keep listening to it like over and over again. And that may work in concert with alcohol myopia theory. You will notice on here, though, that we are far more complex beings than just having sexual arousal, anger. And so the work that I am doing here with Dr. Amlong is actually looking at positive affect. And this hasn't been looked at nearly as much within sexual assault. And I think it's because we've always come at this from the idea that people have to be angry when they're sexually aggressive, or they have to be like, it's just anger and sexual arousal. And I think that is a crucial part of the picture. And I think based on what we've talked about, it's understandable why that's what we're focusing on. However, positive affect is associated with risky behavior, including during alcohol use. Nicole Weiss's work has looked a lot at that, how often people are called upon to downregulate positive affect when they're drinking so that they don't engage in behavior that's going to get them in trouble in some way, shape, or form. Positive affect is also the emotional state most individuals associate with drinking and sexual behavior. It is often when we did qualitative work with men and we asked them, what prompts your decision to go out and maybe look for someone to have sex with, or kind of look with drinking. And some of them did say, oh, when I'm feeling bad or I've had a bad day, I want to, but most of them said, when I'm in a really good mood and I kind of want to go do something fun. that is when they're heading out, at least at the beginning of the night. And often many of them talked about how that positive affect was really present in a lot of sexual situations. And so what I'm really interested in is what's happening when people feel good. Are they more likely to misperceive? Are they maybe more likely to feel a boomerang of anger if rejection comes up? You know, what do we think is happening? We also know that a lot of positive affect is tied with motivational myopia. So we're doing a study here. It's an alcohol administration study where we're going to be doing a mood induction to induce positive affect against a neutral condition to see what effects we may get there. So you can stay tuned for that. The only thing I will end on the what to then what, since I'm running out of time, but is to really just continue to do what seems to work. We have a few universal programs or tailored programs that seem to be okay, but really that we just need more research to directly inform interventions. Those likely need to think about polysubstance use and the role of context. And so with that, I think I will end for today. Thank you all. I think I only missed one slide. We can take questions now. Yeah.
What primary prevention strategies do you recommend?
I have a slide on that. Hang on. Yes, so hang on. So actually the best interventions that we have right now that seem to have long-term effects are for kids and teenagers. You get in early, that's good. So there are these 5 interventions that do seem to have efficacy behind them. Your voice, your view, safe date, shifting boundaries, and 4th are all implemented in schools. And they primarily focus on a variety of kind of health behaviors, but they have a strong focus on healthy communication, what healthy relationships are, kind of gender transformative sort of work around equity related work. Coaching boys into men is an intervention that Liz Miller at Pitt developed that actually is athletic coaches delivering the intervention to like male athletes with like cards and stuff like that. And that got some really exciting results on both intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And so those ones seem to be good. I will also say there are, I think there's some good research on how comprehensive sex education, like delivered really early on, seems to be really good for a lot of this. We need more research on that. It's hard to do research on that. This could be another dig, in part because it's very hard to find people who've gotten comprehensive sex education from a young age in this country and then can look at what they're doing now. But some of Charlene Sen's work on the risk reduction stuff has incorporated curriculum from Our Whole Lives, which is a UU sex education program that's got a lot of data behind it. But yeah, did you have a follow-up or?
I do, but I was just thinking about like your analogy of the lightning strike. When you find one, there's often many, and the idea of the context. And so I was thinking about like sub-TED or crime prevention through environmental design and the idea of
Yes.
like how bars are structured and different things that can be done in the environment. And I didn't know if there was any work being done around that.
Yes, no, that's a great question. There's actually a really great, I don't think I have it on this slide. There's a great paper that came out in 2024 by some like non-sexual assault people. Porat, P-O-R-A-T is the main author, where they essentially were like, no one has made progress on this. We have nothing. And they actually talk about how environmental interventions around the built environment may actually be one of the best ways to do it, particularly looking at, again, like you said, how bars are structured, the kinds of events that they do at bars. If you have like ladies' night, if you have competitions around drinking, if you have like other spring breaky sort of things, getting rid of those. You do though then need to have the folks who do a lot of this work with bars also talk about how, like, if you're going to get rid of those kinds of events, you need to have some kind of larger subsidization financially for them because they make a ton of money off of those events. And so, like, how can we, like, as a society, be like, we're not going to, like, do that. But schools also have put in different kinds of campaigns and stuff in like parts of the school where people tend to congregate and go for, like, one of my old mentors used to say, the thing is that often these events, they start with people who like want to engage in a little behavior and then it goes further than that. And so how, if we accept that like there's gonna be parts of a school where people like smooch, then like how can you like have stuff there that is gonna potentially like decrease the likelihood that it goes? So that's a great question.
We have time for maybe one more.
Yes.
Great talk, very interesting, very thoughtful. The question I have, I guess, is a bit more conceptual in kind of how you're thinking about this. With the preface that like, I don't do any of the study parts.
Yeah.
So the example that you used earlier that I thought was quite interesting, like the lab example where with the you know, giving the participant, you know, this like a description of like a female participant and then saying like she doesn't like the sex, you know, to see like, so, and then having them like choose a video. So I'm thinking about that example, which really indicates a degree of like willingness to push something on an individual that doesn't want it, and presumably that would be, you know, sure, I would imagine you would find that in, you know, the context of alcohol, but also outside of that, right? So I'm like, how do you square that with like some of these theories, especially like, you know, in the alcohol domain, like especially the misperception.
Yeah.
You know, because that seems to indicate a lack of intentionality there, whereas some of those other paradigms seem to hit that really explicitly, and I think that has been kind of an undercurrent of like, you know, ultimately people are willing to do these things, you know, so
Yeah.
how do you kind of like like wrap your head around and kind of think about those things kind of together?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of us do like kind of grapple with that. We also like, when we talk about this, we often are like, oh, over half of sexual assaults involve alcohol. Well, that means that half of them don't, and so.
Right, exactly.
And I will be transparent because I think it's important. Like, I think a lot of our work focusing on alcohol is that it does seem to increase the likelihood of perpetration. And for a long time was where a lot of the funding to study this was. And so a lot of us were really interested in looking at it. And it was one place where we had that. I will say that I'm gonna go back a slide. One of the reasons I like alcohol myopia theory, and I think it allows us to have a lot of in the moment kind of assessment. I actually will say that my current theory of favor is this motivational facilitation model, because the idea is that people have different, more trait level motivations that may or may not be related to sexual assault. And so those motivations could be like, they could be related to sexual assault. They could be like things around rape myths. It could be around things like sexual entitlement. It could be things around gender norms. It also could be around things like really wanting to have a lot of sex. And we can digest whether that's related to gender or not. But like you have these sort of trait level kind of motivations, but then you have these situational motivations and facilitators. And those facilitators could involve something like alcohol. It also could involve nothing related to alcohol, like you're in the moment sexual arousal. That model also accounts for bystanders and like the environment around you. So the person who developed that, Michael Cito, most of his early work was actually in people who offend against children. And so like one of the biggest things that prevents offending against children is having adults present who will stop something, like just having supervision present, having people around a child will prevent something like that from happening. And so he's really kind of moved into this sort of more adult space. And I really like that model because I think it captures alcohol, and I think we can build alcohol expectancies and myopia into those processes. But I think that model also captures that there's like a wealth of facilitators around like having peers who qualitative work with some people around bystander interventions are like, men who like see something happening and are like, oh, let's like go get like pizza, or like, let's like, they kind of intervene and separate people from the situation, versus people who are like, yeah, like go, like you should go do that, and so it captures some of those things as well. Yeah.
I think we'll have to stop there.
Sure.
Great, thank you. And if there's any trainees, undergrads, grad students who would like to talk with Dr. Neilson a bit more, at 2 o'clock today upstairs on the 3rd floor. We'll just come to 3061. So it's going to be like a snack hour.